Anyway, today's lecture, I'm going to, of course, be talking about, like I said, the end of the Cold War. It really kind of ends, I guess, in the early 90s. I'll kind of get into that. And then I'll kind of briefly talk a little bit today about some modern stuff that's happened, I guess, in the last few decades that I guess are kind of famous that probably a lot of you already kind of know about because it's, I guess, stuff that happened in the last few years. It's almost like current events that actually have happened, all of that. Now, previously, I think the last thing we had talked about, we were talking about the Lyndon B. Johnson Nixon era. I think that's where we were kind of. I think we were on the Vietnam War and all that, and kind of talked about the end of the war. And then I think I mentioned how Nixon came in, and I think I told you he got elected in 1968 because of the Vietnam War. Also, because of all the unrest that was kind of going on in the country. And I think we were getting up to like Nixon's second term, which Nixon's second term is, as you know, is heavily, marred by the so-called Watergate scandal, of course, that occurred under him in the early 1970s. And of course, if you remember correctly, a lot of it had to do with that so-called Pentagon papers that came out. I told you that Daniel Ellsberg had kind of been behind, who had leaked it to the New York Times. Ellsberg almost went to prison for it, by the way, but eventually they ruled against that Supreme Court. You can see in that newspaper article right there. And so if you remember correctly, Nixon had formed this unit that was called the White House Plumbers. It was dubbed, which I think I told you was created right after the Pentagon papers were actually released. To stop classified leaks that were kind of going on. And what was the White House Plumbers? It was this covert White House Special Investigations Unit that was created by, they think, Nixon sometime in the summer of 1971, like maybe about June 71. And they were involved in a lot of illegal activities, which kind of why Nixon ends up getting in trouble for this. These are some examples of some of the men that were in the so-called White House Plumbers. E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, Frank Sturgis, James McCord, David Young. And I forget which one it is. I think it was David Young had made a remark to, I think, one of his mother or grandmother, I think it was. And she would ask him, "What are you doing in the White House?" "I'm stopping leaks." And so, "Oh, you're a plumber." That's, of course, where the nickname, of course, came from, the White House Plumbers. So anyway, a lot of these guys were, by the way, like either FBI, some I think were even, it's connected with the CIA and all that were hired, basically. And what got Nixon in trouble was they were involved in a bunch of these break-ins. There were two break-ins that were kind of known. There was one in 1971 where they broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. His name was Lewis Fielding, who was in that office in Los Angeles. And they were trying to dig up dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. And if you know about it, they tore the whole place apart, trying to find stuff, but they never did. Didn't find anything. And then, of course, the thing that really got Nixon in trouble, as you know, was 1972. This is like when Nixon's running for re-election. What happened was bunch of these plumbers broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the now Watergate complex, which was a combination of it's like a hotel there and kind of a business complex that's in Washington, D.C. Now it's, of course, infamous for what happened and how it brought down Nixon and all that. And apparently there were 5 men that were arrested on June 17th, 1972. There's the men right there. Of course, you can see the 2 of them were part of the White House Plumbers that was famous, James McCord, Frank Sturgis. And what they did was they were going in there to try to set up some kind of wiretapping where they were going to tap the phones of the DNC to, I guess, dig up dirt, whatever they could on them, basically. And so they were arrested. And part of why they were arrested, by the way, was apparently when they were going through the complex, the hotel, they taped all the doors so they wouldn't lock. And so some kind of night watchman found this out, and they got arrested And what they found out about these men, that a lot of them were working for Nixon's so-called Committee to Re-elect the President, which is also often usually an acronym, CRP, or they made fun of it later and said CREEP, CREEP, like Nixon's a creep. And anyway, CRP helped Nixon raise a lot of money and win the election. And Nixon ended up, by the way, winning the election in a landslide over George McGovern of South Dakota. Won 520 electoral votes. Crazy. 49 out of 50 states were actually won. So really this whole Watergate thing was really, they didn't even have to do that because Nixon just routed McGovern in the election. But later on, it comes back to, bite Nixon later because of what happened. By the way, the CRP, by the way, used about $500,000 in funds that were raised from Nixon's campaign to pay some of the legal expenses for the 5, Watergate burglars that were arrested. They were put on trial afterwards. And this became a very explosive political scandal that turned it into that, when find out they start using money for that kind of thing. And they also found, I think one of the guys had a black book on him. I know that. And they had found a number in it, and they called the number, and it was the White House. So it's obviously they were kind of connected to Nixon there. So over time, what happened, the burglars and the Nixon administration officials were eventually indicted, of course, for the break-in. There was a bunch of people. They had the so-called Watergate 7. I don't know if you know about that. That were basically advisors and aides to Nixon. They got in trouble, of course, for the Watergate scandal because they played kind of a role in it, but also the cover up of it also as well. So a lot of them also actually saw prison for that. These are the most famous that got in trouble for Watergate. John N. Mitchell, of course, as Attorney General. H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff of the White House under Nixon. And then John Ehrlichman, of course, was another Nixon assistant that also got in trouble as well, eventually indicted for all of this as well. Also, the Watergate hearings followed as well, which were big, 1973-74, roughly. And Sam Ervin, who was a senator, Democrat senator, I think it was North Carolina, I believe was from, is the one that started the so-called Senate Watergate Committee that began to investigate the DNC, break-in. And they eventually found out that, all these men were somehow connected to Nixon in all that. And so it was like on national TV, like people watching these, hearings that were kind of going on. I was too young to kind of remember that. I was kind of like probably only a few years old. But what they found out later about Nixon was that Nixon was keeping this set of tapes in the White House because he was kind of working on his memoirs that he was going to write after he went out of office. And so what happened was eventually there was a court case, United States versus Nixon, to basically get these tape recordings released to the public. Nixon tried to fight it. And eventually the Supreme Court ruled against him, and he was forced to release the so-called White House, Nixon tapes and all that. And what they found 2 tapes that were kind of, suspicious. One tape was discovered where it was basically part of it was erased. About 18 and a half minutes was missing on it. And somebody had erased. And Nixon said, "Oh, my secretary must have accidentally erased it. Oops," that kind of thing. So who knows what was on that tape. But there was another tape, second tape, they found, which was often called the smoking gun tape. And that one basically proved that Nixon was involved in the cover-up of Watergate. And what did Nixon actually do to cover up Watergate? What he tried to do was he tried to use the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to basically influence the FBI to basically stop investigating the whole Watergate scandal. So that's what basically got him in trouble. And eventually his whole support plummeted pretty much. He almost could have been impeached in 1974, I think, if he wouldn't have resigned. Nixon had other problems too as well. I don't know if you know about his vice president was Spiro Agnew. He got convicted 1973 of not paying his taxes. So he had to resign. And so what happened was Gerald Ford of Michigan, who was from the House of Representatives, became the vice president. He was appointed. And so Ford, who becomes president after Nixon resigns, is the only person to ever become vice president and president without being elected, which is true, of course, about that. 43 people totally were, by the way, convicted of the Watergate scandal. That's not total people. And if you know about the Washington Post was heavily involved in, of course, creating a lot of news articles, of course, about the Watergate scandal. And if you ever heard of Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, they, of course, became very famous journalists, of course, for uncovering basically Watergate. And they had this inside guy, if you know about, that was in the FBI. His name was Deep Throat. You ever heard of that guy, Deep Throat? And anyway, he was giving them information about what was going on with Watergate. And they found out later in more modern times that the guy was actually a man named Mark Felt, F-E-L-T, in the FBI. They later made novels, movies, of course, about Watergate. The most famous was in 1976, All the President's Men. Probably may have seen that movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. So they've kind of romanticized it, and all of that, the so-called Watergate thing. But that was a big, big scandal in American history. And it forced Nixon to eventually resign, which you can see. Here's a picture of resigning and leaving at that point. So he resigned on the date of August the 8th, 1974, stepped down. And, of course, Gerald Ford became president of the United States, 38th president. And of course, as you know, Ford turned around and he pardoned Nixon, which is kind of controversial, maybe the right thing to do, more or less. Yeah, that's how Ford comes in. Maybe that was a deal he made with Nixon. Hey, you become president, but you got to pardon me. That kind of thing, that kind of deal. But Ford came in because of the 25th Amendment, of course, which allowed for some kind of succession to, of course, the president. And so he became vice president before that, and then president after that, like I said. Now, let me talk a little bit about Gerald Ford's administration, who he was after Nixon went out of power. Ford was a famous football star at the University of Michigan. He was also in World War II in the Navy. And before that, he had served actually multiple terms in the House of Representatives for Michigan. And you can see he actually served on the Warren Commission, which LBJ put him on there. So he's been around quite a while, Gerald Ford. Now, I told you he was appointed basically vice president by Richard Nixon, of course, because of his VP, Spiro Agnew, had, of course, forced to resign at that point. And talk about some of the policies that happened under Ford. Yeah, I guess so. He tried to cover things up, and Ford had to deal with it, of course, when he came in. And not just that, Ford, of course, had to deal with all kinds of things, of course, that was issued. But under Ford, which Nixon had started, he had what they call détente started in the 1970s. Détente was where basically there was the tensions between Soviet Union and the United States was kind of relaxed. The term détente is a French word meaning relaxation. So in the 70s, we had this deal where we began to open up the Soviet Union and vice versa, and also China as well. If you know about it, I think there was a deal in 1972 where Nixon went to China and visited with the, of course, the People's Republic of China and all that. So that's the kind of stuff kind of going on in the 70s. And then in Soviet Union, they had this guy named Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled the Soviet Union, who was, by the way, the second longest reigning ruler behind Stalin of the Soviet Union. And Brezhnev helped to kind of, I guess, ease tensions as well between East and West. They had the SALT agreements that was made between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what that was, the SALT agreement, which SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, limited the amount of ballistic missiles launchers that both sides could have. Basically, doesn't mean you can have like I guess a ton of missiles or whatever, but it basically limited the amount of missile launchers where you can, I guess, shoot them into space. So that was supposed to kind of, I guess, initial thing that was supposed to prevent further arms race. I think later they had the INF treaties, they got later, with when Reagan's president and all that. They had the Helsinki Accords, which I think were done in 1975 in Finland. That was a deal where the West and the Eastern Bloc countries kind of got together to improve international relations. And they talk about trying to reduce tensions between both sides by trying to create more transparency between different countries, East, West. Like the Soviet Union needs be more transparent about running their state, upholding civil rights, human rights, things like that, and trying to do things in more of a nonviolent way between powers, and all of that. So those are things that, I guess Ford was kind of involved in. But Ford really suffered through a period, him and Jimmy Carter right after, they suffered through a period I told you about before called stagflation, where the economy nosedived. The 70s was a horrible economic period. And it was massive inflation, bad recessions that occurred at that time. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had the oil crisis and the energy crisis that, of course, happened in the 1970s. And so that made basically everything go up in price. So gasoline, oil, food went up in price. If you bought a car, I think back in the old days, you could buy a car for like $3,000, $4,000. So they start getting up like $10,000, about 1980 or something like that. So triple the amount of what it costs to buy a car or something like that or more. Hell, cars today cost what, 30, 40,000 for a nice car, I guess. So yeah, all this inflation, of course, that would of course follow. And what actually caused all this? Well, if you know about the Arab countries, they put an embargo on selling oil to the West, which of course led to the oil crisis. And a lot of it had to do with the Arab-Israeli wars that broke out in the Middle East, which the one that I think that helped cause really the oil crisis in the end was the Yom Kippur War, 1973, where Israel was fighting Egypt and a bunch of Arab countries. And what happened was under Nixon, who was still president at the time, they decided to basically give direct aid militarily to Israel. So I think that was Henry Kissinger's idea. He was the Secretary of State under Nixon. And so that basically caused the whole oil crisis later, which happened multiple times. I think around 73, and then I think in the late 70s under Carter, it happened again. And kind of show you, I think, down here about some of the things here. But yeah, here's kind of showing you the oil spikes. The cost of oil kind of goes up. You can see going all the way back to like here. Look how cheap oil was. This is for like dollars a barrel. You can see it starts climbing here and going up and up and up. Look at this now up here, of course, going way up there. So you can see here, and of course, obviously, gas used to be nothing, 10 cents a gallon or something like that, 20 cents a gallon or whatever. And so it goes all, you can see here back in the 73, it went up to 80 some cents a gallon, which that was pretty much a lot of money back in those days. Ford's administration, by the way, went through different things, which I guess I'll mention a little bit about. here. So yeah, you've got that stagflation thing. Also, I mentioned it already, but they were actually the end of the Vietnam War came April 30th, 1975. That ended with, I think I told you about this before, but the North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Saigon fell. And so this was all caused by, Richard Nixon, his whole Vietnamization idea to get us out of that war because it was unpopular. And so Vietnamization failed in trying to get the South Vietnamese to fight North Vietnam. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that we didn't give enough aid to South Vietnam. And so that's part of why it failed in the end. Now Vietnam is a unified communist country. They're now kind of our ally now. He also survived there were two female assassins that tried to kill him. I think it's kind of stupid. Yeah, there was 2 attempts on his life. I know that kind of failed. It was kind of weird. So anyway, that's another story. But so yeah, let me go ahead and move on. Now, what happened next was that Ford ran for re-election in 1976 against Jimmy Carter, who, by the way, was an outsider in, I guess, this election. And he was it was actually challenged by multiple people. So first of all, he ran against Jimmy Carter, who was, by the way, a peanut farmer, or I think he was ex-peanut farmer. I guess he was still a peanut farmer at the time, from Georgia. And then he was also challenged by Ronald Reagan. Reagan will later be president later, starting after 1980. Reagan challenged him, believe it or not, from California. He was a governor. But Carter was a dark horse. He was this guy that was kind of like this outsider that people wanted to come in, kind of like Donald Trump was, I think, in 2016, kind of similar to that. And part of why Carter had joined the Democratic Party was to fight for civil rights for African Americans and things like that. And so that's actually why he, of course, became, president later. And Ford, of course, in this election, eventually was defeated in 1976, partially because of all the really issues, the stagflation, talked about the energy crisis, of course, and all of that. That didn't help, and all of that. And Carter, and of course the Nixon thing, with him pardoning Nixon, that didn't help either. And so Carter would defeat Ford. And the 1976 election is an interesting election because the fact that it's really considered one of the last elections where the Democrats won the South, like the Solid South, as it used to be called, minus Virginia. You can see there. But after that, very few candidates win states in the South. I think the other ones are basically, I think the other Democrats that won were Bill Clinton and Joe Biden. Not too many Democrats have really won too much after that. Now, under Carter, there was a lot of things. His administration wasn't any better either than Ford's administration that was there. He suffered through the same thing. They had stagflation going on. They had the energy crisis that kept going into the 70s. And then they had also the Iranian Revolution that really kind of messed up his whole administration in the end. And oil prices, would eventually come down, but it's something that would of course continue, into his presidency and all that. But I guess the thing they always talk about with Jimmy Carter that's real famous, if you know about it, Carter was very famous for a lot of his foreign policy changes that he did, which, if you know about it, he was one of the very few presidents that got a Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. Anyway, what happened was he was involved in these deals with Egypt and Israel. He got like new foreign policy changes with that, which led to the so-called peace deal between Israel and Egypt. It's often called the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which was in 1979. And at what is they call it also the Camp David Accords as well. And what happened was he got the two rulers of Egypt and Israel to meet, like in the United States. They came here, and it was Anwar Sadat, of course, of Egypt. And you had also the Prime Minister, Menachem Begin of Israel. And if you know about it, the Israelis had basically been at war with Egypt going back to the 40s and 50s. But Israel in 1967 had seized control of the Sinai Peninsula. This was in the so-called Six-Day War, which happened in 1967. And so what they did was they actually withdrew their forces from the Sinai Peninsula. They gave all that land back, of course, to Egypt. And then in return, the Israelis were given free navigation of the Suez Canal. They could sail their ships in the Red Sea, the Strait of Tiran also as well, at the bottom of the Red Sea. And so it helped to normalize relationships between those two countries. And they even had a case where they exchanged ambassadors between them. So in the end, he got a Nobel Peace Prize for that, I think, after he left office and all that. And it's part of something you're starting to see more in the Middle East, where I think countries like Israel are starting to be more friendly to some of these other Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and so on and all that. Carter was known for some other things you may have heard about. He gave away the Panama Canal. I think that's one thing that's kind of controversial, about Jimmy Carter, which was the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977 that basically superseded the previous one, Hay-Bunau-Faria treaty we talked about before. And it basically gave the Panama Canal over to them in 1999. That's when we'd give it back to them, basically. And it's kind of a controversial thing. I think we kind of needed it. I don't think it was as important. I think later, because of the Cold War ended. But I think at the time when they did it, the Cold War was still going on. And so some people thought that was kind of controversial. But I think it was also creating a lot of tensions between us and Panama, I know, at the time, because we had a lot of Americans living there causing problems with their people. And so he eventually handed it over to them. So and all that. Carter also had to deal with another issue that had to do with the Soviet Union, which was well known. Here's some more slides, of course. Some other things that happened under him. And that was the thing that happened around 1979, 1980. And that was the so-called Soviet-Afghan War began, where the Soviet Union invaded in Afghanistan. This is all part of Brezhnev's policy called Brezhnev Doctrine, where they were trying to go in and protect certain states that were communist. They didn't want to get overthrown. I think the government of Kabul in Afghanistan was pro-communist, and so they invaded. And what happened was, as Afghanistan became this proxy war, where the United States began supporting a lot of the Muslim rebel fighters that were in Afghanistan, which later became known as the Mujahideen. And so the United States supported men like Osama bin Laden, who was like some of their leaders that were part of that group that were fighting in Afghanistan. And if you know about Afghanistan, Afghanistan was one of those things that helped to they think, cause the decline of the Soviet Union. It became kind of like Soviet Union's like Vietnam. So also, because of what happened in Afghanistan, the United States and other countries, if you know about it, put sanctions on the Soviet Union. They boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics that were being held in Moscow. So very few countries actually participated in that Olympics. I think the Soviets won just about all the medals in the whole event. So all those are kind of the things that were kind of happening foreign policy under Carter. And they had one more thing that happened, which was, of course, the thing that really hurt him the most, if you know about it, and pretty much led to why he didn't win the presidency. That was what happened with Iran, the so-called Iranian Revolution that occurred next. And what happened was in 1978-79, radical extremists seized control of Iran. They took over the country by 1979, and they forced the ruler of Iran out. His name was the Shah. He was Shah Mohammad Reza, I think was his full name, who we supported. He was forced basically to live in exile. And so Iran became this religious autocracy that was run by this man named the Ayatollah Khomeini, who you may have heard of. I think he made songs about the guy. So there he is on the left. And what happened was they broke into the American embassy that was in Iran. They took a bunch of Americans hostages. They became the Iranian hostage crisis, is what they called it. And they were held for 444 days. That's how long they were basically held hostage by him. And it helped basically Carter lose the election in 1980 against Ronald Reagan, because I think Reagan kind of helped get him out, they think. I think Reagan must have made a deal with him. I think they found out later he did make a deal with him, which I'll talk about later. And so, yeah, that was kind of an issue that really, not just the economy and all these other things, but that was the thing that really broke, basically, him. All right. So then, of course, like I said, you have the 1980 election that they had also as well, where Reagan, of course, would eventually win the election over Jimmy Carter. And a little about Reagan. Reagan, if you know about him, was a governor of California. He was a conservative. He had been a former actor. He had been in a bunch of movies. I think they were mostly B movies, predominantly. They heard that one where, what's that one about the Newt Rockney or something like that? Win one for the Gipper or something like that. I think he was in that movie. I remember that one. Not too many good movies. And I think he was on the radio a lot also as well, Reagan. And Reagan was had a really good sense of humor. He was often called the great communicator. And he would often tell a lot of jokes. That's one thing he's kind of famous for, Reagan. Something he told like about the Soviet Union, which was kind of funny about that. But anyway, he campaigned on basically trying to increase defense spending because he thought that could help to end the Cold War. Because one of the things that Reagan does to defeat the Soviet Union, they get them in an arms race, which kind of kills them. And then also he cut taxes a lot, which is famous as well. He wants to balance the budget, which I think they kind of blow that up though, because of all the spending and all that. But he is known for supply side economics and all that, which was later called Reaganomics, I think is what they basically dub it. And Reagan ends up winning the actual electoral vote in a landslide. But it's really weird election. Reagan only actually won 50.7 of the actual percent of the popular vote. It's kind of a weird thing with that. But he won 489 electoral votes, defeating Carter. I think that other guy, John Anderson, ran as an independent, by the way. He got like 6-7% of the vote, which is pretty good, I guess, for that time period. But I'll get to it later, but George H.W. Bush is the vice president of Ronald Reagan, who was from Texas. Those two ran against each other in the 1980 election. I don't think they really liked each other, believe it or not, Reagan and Bush. But they ended up becoming together as a ticket, of course, in that election. Now, Reagan, of course, who came in after, he, of course, is basically president from 1981 to 1989. He's very important. He did several things, of course, in Washington that's well known. He created a resurgence of conservatism, which they often call it the Reagan Revolution in basically the 1980s and 90s afterwards. And even had a case where the Republicans even seized control of the Senate, which they had not had, by the way, almost 30 years since 1955. So it's pretty impressive. And Reagan was more known for his foreign policies. Like he cut taxes and all that kind of stuff. He's kind of known for and other things like that. They call it Reaganomics and so on. But Reagan really became more known for his foreign policy issues, especially dealing with the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. And so they think a lot of his policies in his two terms helped to really end the Cold War in the end, which I'll kind of talk a little bit about today. By the way, Reagan was one of the last presidents to, by the way, almost be assassinated. He was given a speech in, I think, March of 1981, which was in Washington, D.C. I think it's at the Hilton in Washington, D.C., and he was walking out. This man named John Hinckley Jr. shot him, and I think a few other men, including James Brady, and Reagan almost died. He came very close to dying, basically. And the reason why Hinckley shot him, believe it or not, he was trying to impress a girl, Jodie Foster, who was an actress at the time. You might have heard of her anyway. That's why he tried to shoot him. Crazy that. So I don't think anybody else has come close really to assassinating any president after that. That was the closest we really ever had, more or less. So yeah, that was like, and of course, what happened when Hinckley, after he shot him, they had this act that was passed under Reagan. I do want to mention about called the Brady Act. You may have heard of it, which is so-called Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. And what that basically did was it forced basically the federal government had to do background checks on people. So if you want to go buy a gun, they have to do a background check on you before you can purchase a gun from like a dealer or whatever. So that's something that they start doing, in the United States, of course, after that with the Brady Act and all that. Now, let me get more into the things that Reagan's more known for, of course, as president. Of course, we'll talk about Gorbachev, of course, who comes in as president of the United States. Reagan was very anti-communist. About Reagan, he said that the Soviet Union is the evil empire and that it had to be basically rolled back or basically destroyed eventually, hopefully. And so that's why Reagan began supporting a lot of policies against the Soviet Union. He even began, sending more arms to like Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. Of course, later they also send money to the Contras, Nicaragua, that are fighting the Sandinistas in the Nicaragua Civil War. Because there are people down there trying to bring in communism, I guess, down there. And so Reagan's the one that they think helped end détente. There's one thing he did in the 80s. And one way he did that, of course, was to build up the U.S. military, get us more into an arms race with the Soviets. And it's one of those things that helped eventually kill off, the Soviet Union. And he had this thing he wanted to do that was really, real big. If you know about Reagan, he had this idea called the Star Wars program, which was the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. It was this idea to create a nuclear umbrella where we'd have satellites in space, and if the Soviets tried to launch missiles at it, we could just knock them down. So it's something that the Reagan pushed a lot in the 80s. They kept doing it after that. I think they're still kind of working on it now. I know that. So it's something that kind of helped to basically eventually maybe kill off the Soviet Union. But Reagan came to power if you want to know about Reagan, he came to power in the 1980s. Here, of course, a picture of Reagan, right? Not Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the ruler of Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. So he's the last ruler that they have. And what happened was him and Reagan started meeting. And so they wanted to create more peace between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they thought that if they could limit the amount of nuclear missiles that could be used, that could help to end the Cold War. And so eventually what happened, if you know about the two men, they eventually came up with this thing called the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty, which stood for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, is what it meant. And under this treaty, basically, it would limit the amount of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and launchers with ranges of 310 to 620 miles and then 620 to 3,420 miles. So I think basically you can only have long-range missiles is what it amounted to. And this was actually around until 2019. But if you know what happened under Donald Trump, they decided to get rid of it because mostly Russia was not complying with it. And I think there's also Trump was concerned that China also might cause an issue. They might need missiles. And so it's no longer in use anymore. But they do think it was one of those issues that helped to cause basically the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev, by the way, was known for some new policies in the Soviet Union you may have heard of. There was one called perestroika, which you've probably heard of, which meant restructuring, which was a term they basically used for this idea to create some forms of capitalism in the Soviet Union, to create economic reform. And then also Glasnost was an idea to create more openness, more freedoms in the Soviet Union and all this. So he's trying to reform the Soviet Union, but they think in the end that a lot of these policies actually of Gorbachev helped to cause the Soviet Union to collapse later, which it did. Reagan, by the way, was famous during the Cold War for coming to West Berlin, near where you see the Brandenburg Gate behind him. And he gave that famous speech telling Gorbachev to tear down, the Berlin Wall, tear down this wall, is what he said, basically. And so within, I think it's 87 when it was, not 86, but basically when that happened, of course, after that, later within a few years, eventually the Berlin Wall will fall. I think when the fall of Berlin Wall happens, that's pretty much the thing that really leads to eventually, the whole Cold War declining. Before I move on, I did want to talk a few more things about Reagan that were kind of famous as well that occurred that you may have heard about. Reagan had this other thing he had called Iran-Contra, which was something big that happened in his second term. And that was a big political military scandal where the U.S. had created this arms for hostage deal with Iran, where they got Israel to sell weapons to Iran to help get those hostages out. You remember correctly about that. And some of the money was being taken and they sent it to Nicaragua, where they were giving money and arms to the Contras. The Contras were these anti-communist guerrillas. They were fighting in Nicaragua against what they call the Sandinistas. They were Marxist communists. And so it became a big scandal. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was a famous U.S. Marine, was actually indicted for it and eventually went to prison. Ollie North, they called him for short, of course. And so that became a big scandal. But by that time, I think Reagan was starting to lose his memory. And he's like, I don't know what happened, that kind of deal. So, yeah, I think he had Alzheimer's, I think, near the end of his life, and he forgot a lot of things that happened, at the end. So he was pretty old, I think, when he went out of office, Reagan. Now, after Reagan left office, they also had, of course, another president that came in who followed him, which was George H.W. Bush, who was president only one term from 1989 to 1993. And Bush, by the way, was the president when the Berlin Wall fell. He's actually the one in power when basically the Cold War would actually come to an end. Bush, by the way, defeated Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election, was governor of Massachusetts easily. Bush had been the vice president of Texas. Also, before he had been a CIA, he had the CIA at one point, Bush. And so, yeah, you start seeing basically the fall of basically the Cold War starts to come to the end about the time of under when Bush is in power. And so one thing that happens is the Berlin Wall comes down, of course, in 1989. You have Germany that gets reunified as one state after that. So you got that happening. So that was the big thing that happened with that under Bush. And then they also, 2 years later, they had, of course, the Soviet Union collapse as well, where the Soviet Union broke up into different states. And so you get this deal where Eastern Europe starts to become more democratic, capitalist. Russia becomes a democratic republic itself that's more capitalist. And so all this kind of happens within a very short time, a couple of years, more or less. So all that happened really not under Reagan, but when Bush went out of course, office, went into office, of course, at that time. Of course, these are some of the key things that happened in the so-called post-Cold War era, which I guess starts around 1990, 1991, that you can see there. One of the big things that happened under George H.W. Bush at the beginning of his only term in office, they had the Gulf War that broke out, which they call sometimes Operation Desert Storm. That was really the biggest issue that happened, of course, under Bush Sr. And what happened was Saddam Hussein, he was the president of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. This is in the summer of 1990. And, of course, this angered a lot of people. Even the Arabs got pretty angry about Saddam, of course, doing this. And so it led to a big war, of course, in the Middle East, which is like the first of like these two wars that they have, of course, with, Saddam Hussein. They had a second war, of course, under George W. Bush years later. So this led to Operation Desert Storm, which lasted about maybe 6 months. I think it was Desert Shield at first, I know. And then what happened was coalition forces, which included American, British, other European powers, Arab states, put up a massive buildup in what is Saudi Arabia. And, of course, they threatened to invade if Saddam didn't withdraw his forces, of course, out. And so that led to the operations of Desert Storm, where eventually what happened was there was a big ground offensive, if you know about this, that commenced on February 24th, 1991. The ground offensive itself was very short. It was only like about a few days. And the coalition forces basically routed the Iraqis, pushed them back into Iraq. The coalition forces only suffered about 300 killed or less. I think under 300 killed, 292, I think is what it was total. And the Iraqis suffered like 20, 30,000 dead. We just routed them pretty easily in Iraq. But I guess what caused a lot of problems later with the Persian Gulf War was we left Saddam in power instead of trying to eliminate him. And so what happened was they put a bunch of sanctions on of course, Iraq afterwards, which hurt their country. They added no-fly zones to like the north and south part of the parts of Iraq to protect a lot of these Iraqi minorities like Kurds and Shiites and all that. But it would later cause another problem later after 9/11, where we would have the so-called Second Iraq War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, where we eventually would have to invade again, which will be in 2003. After the Gulf War, by the way, Bush's popularity declined. It declined for two reasons. One, they went through a bad recession in the early 90s. And then if you know about Bush did this thing where when he was campaigning in 1988, when he won the presidency, he made this promise, by the way, you may have heard about, where he said that he wouldn't raise taxes. I think he said famously, "Read my lips. No new taxes." And of course, he broke that promise. And so what happened was in the 1992 presidential election, he ran against Bill Clinton, who eventually would defeat him. And Bill Clinton was at the time, the governor of Arkansas. He's kind of real popular in the South and all that. And then there was actually another man that challenged George H.W. Bush, who was also from Texas too, which was Ross Perot, who was this billionaire who believed that they needed to balance the budget and all that. And so Perot got involved as well. And Perot, they think, helped to kind of allow Clinton to eventually win the election. But part of why Clinton won the election wasn't just because of his, fact that he was, kind of good-looking guy and a good speaker and all that. Bill Clinton, popular guy. His campaign manager came up with a great slogan, running against Bush, which you may have heard of him. He's from Louisiana, a guy named James Carville. You may have heard of him. He's big here. And he came up with this slogan, which was, "It's the economy, stupid," basically, instead of other things, other issues, I guess, to run on. And so that's part of why Bill Clinton was able to eventually get elected. But Clinton, by the way, only won the election by 43% of the popular vote, even though he got, I think, a majority of electoral votes, because you had these other two guys running, Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush. Perot almost got 20% of the popular vote. It was pretty good, for somebody who's an independent running. I think it's the best an independent has done in probably years, I think, since after that. By the way, George H.W. Bush is one of only 4 presidents, by the way, to ever lose as an incumbent since World War II. Ford, Carter, Bush, and Trump now, of course. So that's basically something that I guess he's famous for, of course. Let's talk about some stuff that happened under, of course, Bill Clinton. They had this thing called NAFTA, you may have heard about, which really wasn't Clinton's idea. It's actually something that started under George H.W. Bush, but they added this thing, of course, with the economy, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was an agreement made, by the way, that went into effect in 1994 that created basically this trilateral trade bloc between all those 3 countries right there. And it's something that George H.W. Bush started, and then Clinton agreed to it when he came in as president. However, NAFTA was kind of controversial. If you know about it, some people think that it actually helped to move American jobs outside of America to like foreign countries like Canada, Mexico, and mentioned to foreign countries also as well. And Trump would have it replaced 2018 with the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that they have now, which is supposed to create more of a balanced environment for trade, which is why they created it. Better deal, I guess, between countries. And I think the problem was that it wasn't really creating high-paying jobs, unless you, I guess, went to Canada or whatever. And so that was something that kind of made people mad why they replaced it eventually. Clinton was known for a bunch of other things you may have heard about that's well known. That I'll kind of mention about. Clinton was the one that enacted under him through Congress welfare reform, which is true, which they started doing. Also, the 1994 Crime Bill, Violent Crime Control Law Enforcement Act, it was called. It's considered the largest crime bill, by the way, in American history ever created. It was actually drafted by Joe Biden from Delaware, who was in the Senate at the time, and he later, of course, became the current 46th president of the United States. And it provided 100,000 new police officers. They wanted to fight crime, I guess, in the country, which had increased since the 70s and 80s. They spent almost $10 billion on funding for new prisons. They spent $6 billion on funding for crime prevention programs throughout the United States. It also included other things that were part of it. Federal assault weapons ban. That's something, of course, Clinton was kind of famous for, which is, by the way, it's expired, I think, since then. You know about that. Federal Death Penalty Act, I think, does that do federal crimes. And, of course, something that's still around today, Violence Against Women Act, of course, was also added as well. That was in it. So you got that. That was part of it as well. So that's just some things that were kind of going on under Clinton. That's kind of well known overall. They did have this thing happen where when Clinton was president in 1994, Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, which they hadn't had in years at that point. And it led to this resurgence of conservatism in Washington. You may have heard of Newt Gingrich from Georgia. He, of course, was famously involved in this whole thing. And he was involved in forcing Clinton to balance the budget, which I think that was the last president to actually balance the federal budget under him. Really, it was Gingrich that basically, welfare reform. he had a so-called contract with America. You may have heard about Gingrich. And I think that Gingrich was the one that also they think held, that may have kind of been involved with the whole impeachment of Bill Clinton too, trying to get him impeached and all of that. And that's one thing that's very famous about Bill Clinton's administration that y'all probably know about. Of course, he's famous for the so-called Monica Lewinsky thing that happened under him, where he got in trouble for this whole affair with the White House intern. Monica Lewinsky had some kind of affair with her, which was found out. And so it led to a impeachment, which the trial itself lasted from 1998 to 1999. And it stemmed from actually a relationship. I think he had some kind of this harassment lawsuit, I think by Paula Jones, if you remember about this, that sued him. And Clinton was forced to testify, and he denied having a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, which, by the way, proved to be, I think, wrong. And he was disbarred for perjury. And so eventually what happened was in December of 1998, Clinton became the second U.S. president to be impeached. As you know, Andrew Johnson and Donald Trump have both been impeached also as well. And he actually was it was a close actual, I think by party vote pretty much. But in February 1999, after 5 weeks of deliberation in a trial in the Senate, he was found not guilty, 55 to 45 guilty. So it was all on party lines. Most of the people, most of the senators that voted, I think pretty much all the Democrats voted not guilty, and all the Republicans voted guilty. So it's kind of crazy about how that happened. So I think that I think the impeachment thing hurt Hillary Clinton later, probably more or less, because Hillary Clinton tried to run for president, twice, 2008, 2016, and I think that kind of hurt her later, more or less. Now, later, what happened next, they had this 2000 election that they had to follow, you probably heard about, which is very famous. And in 2000, you had Al Gore from Tennessee, who was Clinton's vice president, running against George W. Bush of Texas, who was the son of George H.W. Bush. And if you know about it, it was one of the closest elections in U.S. history. It came down to disputes over electoral votes in Florida's presidential election, and it led to a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court, so-called Bush versus Gore that happened. And what happened was the Supreme Court eventually ruled in favor of Bush. They forced them to stop the count, and so Florida was given, electoral votes were given over to Bush. But I think it went back and forth where both of them actually conceded at one point, believe it or not, in 2000. And they didn't really settle this until almost the beginning of 2001. But you can see with the electoral votes that it was really close. Bush got 271 and Gore got 266. So it could have either gone either way, of course, with this election. Let me talk about some of the famous events that happened, of course, under George W. Bush's administration. He had all kinds of things that happened, of course, under him. Of course, the 9/11 attacks, that's a big event that happened. Of course, war on terror against Al-Qaeda, Taliban. They got the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. Hurricane Katrina, which we're kind of familiar with, of course, in Louisiana, was another issue that he dealt with in his second term that he had, of course, which he serves 2 terms from 2001 to 2009. And, of course, the most famous event that really happened under George W. Bush was the 9/11 attacks, where, as you know, terrorists from Al-Qaeda who used, of course, airliners attacked the Twin Towers in New York City, took them both down. It happened, of course, on the date of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, which resulted, by the way, in almost 3,000 Americans being killed in the attack. Over 25,000 were actually injured. You can see the amount of damage that was done to New York, et cetera, Pentagon and all that, which was like $10 billion worth of damage that, of course, occurred, which we're still kind of suffering from this today. You know, a lot of people that were kind of in the attack are still suffering from it or still ill from it. And something that, of course, that would eventually lead into later, which, of course, would be the so-called War on Terror, which would follow with that, what pretty much still going on. The War on Terror going back to Bush's administration. And so for a bunch of years from 2001, you know, up to the present, we were involved in all these different efforts to eliminate various terrorist organizations in the world, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS later too, like in Iraq, Syria, all that as well. So all those are things that happened, of course, under Bush's administration. That's well known. Also, other things he's famous for, I'll mention about Bush that you may have heard about. Domestically, he was involved. You ever heard of No Child Left Behind? That was some act that he created during his administration. Probably the most domestic thing that dealt with education reforms, which gave, you know, education more standards and all that. It's part of why you take all these standardized tests. Like, you know, like leak tests or whatever, where you take a test to graduate from high school. It was all because of the No Child Left Behind Act. I didn't have to do that when I was in school. I didn't have to take a test to graduate or whatever. But I don't know why they do it still. But anyway, and of course, he cut taxes. That's one thing he did that's well known, which, of course, a lot of people got refunds and all that, of course, because of that. The only thing about his presidency that's well known that was on the negative side, they had the Great Recession, of course, that occurred following that. And so what happened was, if you know about it, from 2007, 2009, up to like the Barack Obama was, he was in president, they had this worldwide economic decline where there was massive unemployment. And you had basically a deal where a bad recession occurred because of the housing bubble burst. There was a deal where during his second term, the stock market crashed, housing prices crashed, more or less, and it ended up causing consumers to stop spending money on buying things. And so people lost their jobs and created massive unemployment in the country. About 8.4 million people at one point were unemployed in the country. I think both my brothers at one point lost their jobs during that time period. I was kind of lucky because I think people, when they have a bad situation like that, people go back to school. So I was kind of able to stay pretty much employed because of that for education. But it's pretty much the reason why Barack Obama gets elected. If you think about 2008, Barack Obama would follow as president 2009 to 2017. And due to the recession, you had Obama, who was really a dark horse. Nobody really heard of him much, except maybe in Illinois. He was also a senator at that time, and he ran against John McCain of Arizona, who was a Vietnam War hero. He'd been shot down over Vietnam. And Obama ended up, as you know, serving 2 terms. He, of course, became the first African-American president to be elected in American history. And he won by a landslide. You can see there 365 electoral votes to McCain's 173 electoral votes. And part of why he got elected was just because of the economy, but Obama was also a great speaker. And of course, like when Trump was, I think, running or whatever, saw before, just thousands of people would come to watch him, you know, and all that. And his VP was Joe Biden, who would later, you know, be president. And of course, 46th president right now that we have. Let me go through and just talk about a few things that Obama was known for real quick that you may have heard about. Obama is the one that helped sign into legislation what they call the Affordable Care Act, which of course was this act designed to, you know, get cheaper health care insurance and all that. Some people think it increased it, but it was known as the ACA or Obamacare. It's something that's still around today. It's probably one of his most famous things he did as president when he first came in. Also, he's known for Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank was this Wall Street Reform Act that was passed in July of 2010, which overhauled like the regulations in banks and stock markets. And so it put more regulation, people putting money in the stock, also in banks, like mortgages and loans and things like that. They put more regulations into things because part of what caused the housing bubble to burst was because banks were just giving people loans no matter what, even if they hardly made any money. They give them like $500,000 house. They're like a janitor or some kind of person making not any money. They'd give them like a house. A lot of people are buying houses all just off of interest, just paying the interest on it, not the mortgage. And so that was part of why they did that, more or less. Also, the American Recovery Reinvestment Act also was something he also passed into law, which was a stimulus package they created to create like jobs in the country and also save the ones they already have. And it was kind of a stimulus package. They also gave money to people, like stimulus money, like they did, like of course, Trump and Biden did. The most famous thing I think that happened under Obama was that under him, he's the one that sent in the Navy SEALs to kill Osama bin Laden, who was killed in May of 2011, Pakistan. And so I think that's kind of considered one of the most famous moments probably ever in Obama's administration that they had. They finally got the guy, and so that's basically something that he's known for. Obama, by the way, served 2 terms. He basically defeated Mitt Romney in 2012. So he's been in power until 2017. And of course, the 2 presidents that came afterwards, we have a few minutes left, but of course, Donald Trump, as you know, was elected in 2016. Of course, he's one-term president, served from 2017 to 2021. And then, of course, also the current president we have now, of course, is Joe Biden, of course. And so those are the 2 we have now, 45th president and the 46th presidents, of course, currently, of course, that we've had, of course. And COVID, as you know, I think played kind of a role in why Trump lost 2020, if you know about that. I think if COVID wouldn't have happened, I don't think he would have lost because the economy was so good under Trump. And then when COVID happened, it just bottomed out, after that. And so that's probably why Biden came in more or less. So both those are the two current presidents we've had, of course, recently. Biden, of course, fairly new coming in right now in 2021. So that's more like, I guess, current affairs, So anyway, that pretty much wraps up my lecture, of course, on American history. History 2023. Anyway, just a reminder before we go, but don't forget, of course, you've got, the final exam. I'm going to go ahead and post that today. So if you want to go ahead and start working on that this coming weekend, you can, but it will be up till next, I think, Friday, May 7th. So it'll be up for a while. And also, if anybody's doing the Veterans Oral History Project, that'll be due Saturday, May 1st. If you want to turn that into me. And that's pretty much it for the semester. If anybody has any more, comments, questions about the lecture, please let me know later. I don't think anybody has any right now that I see. Looks like Ross, I think, is watching right now. I know. But if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture or any lecture, let me know later. And also, if you have any administrative questions, of course, about the semester, especially at the end, let me know about that as well. So I hope y'all have a great end of the semester. I know we got final exams coming up, so try to study hard, of course, for that. And I hope y'all have a great summer also as well. So I hope y'all take care. I'll see you. I think this fall, of course, we'll have face-to-face classes some, so you might see me on campus, of course, eventually, hopefully. So y'all take care, and of course, Have a great summer. Of course, like I said. So y'all take care.